The morning broke without warmth. Its light filtered through a high veil of winter haze that dulled the horizon over northern Germany. Yet beneath that muted sky, the air already trembled with the deep, synchronized pulse of radial engines. To villagers below, the sound was familiar, an approaching storm of silver shadows, yet it carried a different weight this time. The formation was tighter, the altitudes lower, the tension unmistakable. It was a morning that looked calm but carried the promise of violence. At the rear of the great procession, a single B-17 fell out of rhythm. The bomber's tail had been shredded by the upward roar of flak that moments earlier had turned the sky into a black, incandescent field. Stabilizers hung half-torn. The rear guns sat silent. Control cables fluttered in the slipstream. What remained of the flying fortress drifted like a wounded animal, its silhouette thinning against the cold air as the formation pushed ahead without it. In war, even steel is left behind. Inside that wounded aircraft, the surviving crew moved with the quiet, practiced urgency of men who no longer questioned fate. Oxygen masks hissed, hands shook over frozen metal, and every breath carried the metallic scent of fear and hydraulic fluid. The pilot fought the controls with a steadiness born not of confidence, but of duty, holding the aircraft level because there was nothing else left to hold. Far below, German controllers tracked the bomber stream across thin lines of grease pencil markings. Procedures unrolled with detached efficiency. Altitude plotted, headings confirmed, interceptions assigned. It was the rhythm of a long war, automatic, relentless, exhausted. And from one of the nearby fields, a group of fighters lifted into the winter air, their engines slicing through the cold with predatory precision. Among the pilots was Franz Stigler, an experienced ace shaped by years of attrition. The war had aged him faster than time ever could, leaving him with a pilot's reflexes and a philosopher's eyes. As he climbed through the thinning clouds, he saw the formation ahead and the lone, limping bomber drifting behind. In that widening distance, a meeting neither side had imagined was beginning to form, quiet as a breath before a storm. The B-17 known as Ye Olde Pub sank into a layer of colder air as it drifted farther from the shelter of the formation. Frost gathered along the fractured frames of its windows, blurring the horizon into a pale wash of winter light. Behind the cockpit, the surviving engines coughed in uneven rhythm, two still fighting, one faltering, one nearly dead. Each shudder of the aircraft felt less like motion and more like a plea, as though the machine itself were asking how much farther it was expected to endure. At the controls, Charlie Brown leaned forward against his harness, his fingertips numb beneath heavy gloves. The cold had seeped into him with steady insistence, and every breath left a thin cloud upon the mask pressed to his face. He felt the bomber dragging left, its damaged tail pulling against his corrections. The effort tightened across his chest, each movement a battle against exhaustion and creeping darkness at the edges of his vision. He flew not with confidence, but with the memory of training, holding the line because he could not abandon it. Along the fuselage, the crew worked with quiet desperation. The waist gunner lay pale beneath a blanket of torn cloth, his wounds deep and ragged from the earlier attack. The men tending to him had little more than strips of fabric and the steadiness of their hands. Every jolt of turbulence sent pain through the broken body on the floor, yet the young gunner made no sound. He had spent what strength he had on surviving. In the radio compartment, silence reigned. The set had been shattered by cannon fire, wires hanging like veins severed without warning. With their communications destroyed, the crew had no guidance, no coordinates, no hope of recalling the formation. They flew deaf and blind through enemy skies, a single aircraft carrying more damage than certainty. Ammunition had been nearly spent in the earlier attack. The remaining guns were manned out of principle rather than power, their barrels cold, their belts empty. The men stayed at their stations because leaving them felt like surrender. Ahead, the formation was little more than distant glints in the sun, moving on not through indifference but necessity. Protocol demanded momentum. Survival demanded separation. And so Ye Olde Pub drifted alone, a wounded creature crossing into hostile territory, unaware that another predator had already taken notice. Franz Stigler stepped toward his Messerschmitt Bf 109 with the quiet focus of a man who had repeated this ritual hundreds of times. There was no conversation, no ceremony, only the measured sequence of movements that wartime had carved into instinct. He inspected the leading edges, touched the cold metal of the fuselage, and limbed into the cockpit with the familiarity one gives to a workplace rather than a weapon. Even here, on a hardened airstrip dusted with winter frost, The cockpit felt like the only place where routine still held meaning. Around him, his squadron prepared to launch again. The ground crews moved with the practiced efficiency of men stretched thin by months of attrition. Fuel trucks rolled away, chocks lifted, engines ignited in rising waves of sound. Each pilot strapped in knowing the odds had narrowed with every passing week. Germany's fighter strength had once seemed unshakable. Now it held together through discipline rather than abundance. They climbed because they had to, and because the sky left no room for hesitation. Stigler felt that weight more sharply than most. As an experienced ace, he carried the expectation that he would lead, strike, and return, an unspoken contract with the officers who tracked victory tallies and with the nation that demanded defense at any cost. Yet beneath the hardened exterior, he felt the quieter burden of a man who knew how thin the line between survival and sacrifice had become. Every sortie risked not only defeat, but the erosion of whatever humanity war had not already claimed. When the Bf-109 surged forward and lifted from the runway, the aircraft trembled lightly as it climbed. The engine's steady roar filled the cockpit, drowning thought and heightening awareness. Stigler guided the fighter through breaks in the clouds, the winter sun flashing across his canopy in brief, cold bursts. Up here, the world narrowed to altitude, angles, and intent, an engineer's geometry shaped by lethal necessity. Then he saw it, a faint streak of silver drifting far behind the American formation. Even from distance, he recognized the telltale wobble of a wounded bomber fighting to stay aloft. Training sharpened his focus immediately, pointing him toward the crippled shape with mechanical clarity. Instinct told him what the air war demanded next. And as he banked toward the lonely aircraft, the path set before him seemed fixed, though fate had other designs waiting just ahead. Luftwaffe doctrine had been shaped in the hard furnace of years at war, and every pilot knew its lessons by heart. Stragglers were to be eliminated first. A bomber that drifted alone was no longer part of a fortress-like formation. It was a single machine exposed to the full geometry of attack. Manuals described them as easy kills, not out of arrogance, but out of the cold arithmetic that governed survival. A damaged bomber meant fewer guns firing back, fewer eyes watching the sky, and fewer seconds needed to strike. In the logic of air war, simplicity was a form of mercy to one's own side. Every engagement carried consequences measured far below the clouds. A downed bomber meant one less payload falling on German cities already cracked by months of bombardment. It meant another rail junction spared from collapse, another factory able to turn out needed machinery, another neighborhood where families might sleep without interruption. Pilots were taught that each interception was a thread holding together the nation's fraying edges. When Stigler climbed into his cockpit, he carried not just fuel and ammunition, but the weight of a homeland running out of time. His own missions had long reinforced that belief. Stigler had seen friends vanish in sudden flashes, had watched the Reich's air defenses thin with every passing month. Precision, not sentiment, was what kept a pilot alive. The doctrine did not ask him to hate, it asked him to act decisively. A moment's hesitation could mean being outmaneuvered, outgunned, or outlived. In that world, mercy was a risk, and risks were the privilege of men not fighting for survival. Ahead of him, the wounded bee matched every description the manuals had etched into his training. Its tail structure was mangled, its rear guns motionless, its altitude dropping slowly as if the air itself had grown heavier. The bomber bled speed and stability, each second revealing new weaknesses. It was the very definition of a vulnerable aircraft, the kind of target even a novice could approach without fear. To an experienced ace like Stigler, the engagement felt almost procedural. Fuel calculations only strengthened the logic. The crippled bomber lay along an efficient intercept path, requiring minimal maneuvering and no prolonged chase. A short burst at close range could finish the job, and the return flight would demand little more than a descent toward home. It was a mission profile that promised certainty in a war where certainty had become increasingly rare. His machine guns were loaded, their belts fed tightly into metal housings designed for lethal reliability. His altitude advantage gave him control over the engagement, allowing him to dictate distance, angle, and timing. Everything about the moment felt aligned with the long habits of war. Stigler had climbed for this, trained for this, survived this, thousands of feet above a homeland calling for protection. From the outside, the encounter looked predetermined, the outcome already written in the quiet mathematics of survival. Yet as he closed the distance, something inside the broken bomber shifted, revealing a truth no manual had prepared him to face. From their first days in training, American bomber crews were taught a simple creed: trust the formation, trust the airframe, trust the mission. The doctrine was not born from sentiment but from engineering and arithmetic. When dozens of B-17s held their pattern, their overlapping fields of fire formed a defensive shell as formidable as armor. Alone, a bomber was vulnerable. Together, they were a moving fortress. For the men inside Ye Olde Pub, this belief had been a steady companion, something as constant as altitude and compass headings. The B-17 itself reinforced that confidence. It was built not to outrun or outmaneuver, but to endure. Its designers had given it redundancy in every vital system, from self-sealing tanks to multiple hydraulic pathways. It could lose engines, lose surfaces, lose entire sections of its fuselage and still stay aloft. The aircraft was a statement in metal. Survival was a matter of structure, not luck. And through countless missions, crews had seen bombers return home with wounds that should have destroyed them. In that shared experience, belief became part of the cockpit's instruments. For Charlie Brown, that belief was all he had left to hold. He repeated the doctrine silently as he fought the failing controls. Altitude meant time, discipline meant order, distance meant safety, if they could only maintain it. Even as the horizon wavered and the cold carved into his hands, he trusted the machine beneath him. The B-17 had been built for mornings like this, he told himself. Built to carry damaged wings and weary men a little farther than reason expected. The rugged shell around him became more than metal. It was a psychological anchor, a structure he leaned on when his own strength faltered. Every groan in the airframe seemed to whisper that the aircraft still wanted to fly. Every vibration of the engines insisted that endurance was possible. In the cockpit, Brown clung to that mechanical certainty, the way a sailor clings to the known weight of a ship in rising seas. But belief has limits, and they began to erode as reality intruded. A thin hiss of escaping oxygen signaled a breach the crew could not repair. Hydraulic lines stuttered, their pressure falling in slow, uneven rhythms. Somewhere along the fuselage, a panel rattled as if trying to tear itself free. The aircraft's strength had not vanished, but it no longer felt inexhaustible. The fortress was still standing, yet its foundations trembled. The deepest fracture came in silence. The tail gunner had stopped responding long ago, and the crew avoided speaking his name. They knew the truth, but acknowledging it meant accepting how fragile their situation had become. The quiet from the rear turret was more chilling than any enemy fire. It marked the moment when doctrine could no longer hide the human cost. And so they waited, each man alone with his thoughts, for the silhouette they all knew would appear sooner or later. A German fighter rising from below the clouds, drawn by damage like a predator sensing blood. What none of them could imagine was the nature of the pilot already closing in. Franz Stigler descended toward the crippled bomber with the practiced precision of years in the cockpit. The Bf-109 responded smoothly, its controls taut, its engine steady as he nudged the fighter into firing range. Through the reflector sight, the B-17 grew larger, its wounded tail framing the perfect silhouette his instructors had once used on classroom boards. He steadied his thumb over the gun trigger. The moment felt routine, an action he could complete in less than a second, then climb away before the bomber's wreckage touched the earth. Everything around him supported that expectation. The crippled aircraft lay directly ahead, its trajectory predictable, its defenses presumed weak. A short burst from his 20mm cannon would finish what Flak had begun. Then he would turn home, add another victory to the tally, and fulfill the duty expected of him. In the cold arithmetic of warfare, the encounter required nothing more than discipline. Yet as he drew closer, the script faltered. The bomber did not respond. No tracers arced from its waist guns. No turret swiveled to track him. Instead, the weapons hung still, their barrels lowered in a way no combat-ready crew would ever permit. It was not a trap. It was exhaustion, the kind that follows violence too sudden to recover from. The B-17 flew on, not in defiance, but in resignation. Stigler edged nearer, curiosity overriding procedure. Through the open wounds in the fuselage, he saw movement, slow, uneven, uncoordinated. A gunner slumped against the side of the aircraft, blood SDR. Eked across his jacket. Another crewman struggled weakly with a bandage, his hands trembling as he tried to stabilize a wounded companion. The tail gunner did not move at all. These were not adversaries poised for one final stand. They were men barely holding to consciousness. Training told him this was the ideal moment to strike. An enemy exposed should be eliminated quickly, cleanly, without hesitation. Every second he delayed was another second in which something unpredictable might occur. Another fighter might join the engagement. Another gun might rattle to life. Doctrine insisted on action. But something older stirred beneath those layers of instruction. A voice shaped long before the war. A sense of decency inherited from a world that once believed honor could survive in battle. It whispered that there was no triumph in this kill, no skill proved, no homeland defended. All he saw inside the bomber were wounded men trying to stay alive long enough to reach the edge of the sky. He hesitated. A rare, unplanned pause entered the flow of the fight. His thumb hovered over the trigger but did not press. The aircraft around him seemed to hold its breath, engine humming in steady confusion, as if puzzled why the mission had not already ended. In that single moment, the logic of the air war cracked. The encounter, so carefully shaped by doctrine and necessity, shifted into unfamiliar territory. And what Stigler chose next would carry the confrontation far beyond the expectations of either side. As Stigler held his position beside the battered B-17, a memory surfaced with unexpected clarity. Years earlier, during his training, his instructor, Gustav Rödel, had stopped him after a gunnery exercise. Rödel, a man shaped by an earlier war, had spoken quietly yet firmly. "If I ever hear of you shooting a man in a parachute or a helpless enemy, you will answer to me." In peacetime, such a warning might have seemed philosophical. In the brutal machinery of 1943, it pressed against every lesson the Luftwaffe demanded of its pilots. Yet it returned now, unbidden, as if summoned by the sight of the wounded aircraft drifting beside him. The memory collided with the obligation he carried as a defender of the Reich. Below him lay a homeland strained by shortages, raids, and a dwindling sense of security. Each bomber that reached its target meant shattered walls, lost families, and another step toward a war Germany was already failing to control. Stigler knew this truth intimately. He had flown missions that ended above burning cities, had landed to find neighborhoods erased in the span of minutes. Duty did not need to be explained. It weighed on him with the certainty of gravity. Yet the Luftwaffe's code, so long a compass of discipline, met resistance from something older. Thousands of feet above the ground, the Bf-109 and the B-17 drifted like mismatched companions, and Stigler found the air around him thick with contradiction. The doctrine he lived by insisted on victory. His conscience, faint but insistent, asked him to see beyond it. For the first time in many missions, the sky did not feel like a battlefield. It felt like a place where a decision could echo farther than a shot. He eased back on the throttle and circled the bomber again, taking in its full condition. The tail was shredded to ribbons of metal. The dorsal turret hung inert, its housing cracked open like a broken shell. The nose glazing was spiderwebbed from cannon fire, each fracture reflecting the winter light in sharp, uneven lines. Even the wings bore wounds, patches of torn aluminum, coolant streaks frozen into pale ribbons, and bullet holes glinting like dark stars. No crew should have been alive inside such a ruin, yet somehow they still fought for altitude. Logic told him there was no point in firing. The aircraft would not survive the length of its return journey. Its hydraulics were failing, its oxygen supply depleted, its crew too injured to maintain defensive order. If he simply left it to the elements, the bomber would succumb to gravity long before it crossed the coastline. In that sense, sparing it accomplished nothing tactically. War did not reward gestures, war rewarded efficiency. But compassion urged a different conclusion. This bomber had endured everything the sky could inflict and still clung to its course, held together by engineering and determination in equal measure. Stigler recognized a kind of courage in that persistence, not strategic, not militaristic, but human. It reminded him that the men inside were not abstractions or statistics. They were airmen like him, shaped by their own expectations, carrying their own fears. He drew close again, closer than doctrine permitted. Through the shattered perspex he saw faces. One gunner slumped over his weapon, motionless. Another, pale and exhausted, watched the approaching fighter without lifting a hand to defend himself. Near the cockpit, Stigler glimpsed movement, Charlie Brown, eyes H. Hollow with fatigue, struggling to keep the wings level. There was no hostility in their expressions, only the resignation of men who had reached the limits of endurance. The moment held him firmly. It stripped away the abstractions of nationality, rank, and mission. The opposing aircraft no longer represented an objective. It represented people. And in that fragile clarity, Stigler felt the weight of a choice that neither side had prepared him for. The ace did not speak aloud, but the decision formed in him with quiet finality. He would not fire. He would not add these men to the long list of casualties he carried. For the first time in a long while, he chose humanity over doctrine. And as he settled into position beside the wounded aircraft, the sky around them waited to see what that choice would become. Charlie Brown noticed the fighter before anyone else. Through the fractured glass of the cockpit, he saw a dark shape rising from below, sleek, angular, and unmistakably German. Even in his weakened state, the silhouette of a Bf-109 triggered an instinct older than training: brace for the final blow. He tightened his grip on the control column, feeling its cold metal imprint into his gloves, and steadied the bomber as best he could. There was no maneuver left to make, no height to trade for speed. All he could do was wait for the strike he believed must come. Inside the fuselage, the crew sensed the same approach. Word spread quietly, passed between men who no longer had the strength for alarm. The waist gunners tried to lift their weapons, but the guns offered only the weight of obligation. They had no ammunition, no firing capability, no chance to deter what came toward them. Those still conscious braced against the thin walls of the aircraft, preparing for the impact of cannon shells they would likely never feel. The wounded closed their eyes, not out of fear, but exhaustion. In the dim, freezing interior of Ye Olde Pub, resignation settled like another layer of ice. Fear, however, did not disappear entirely. It tightened in the spaces between heartbeats, in the subtle tremor of breath held a moment too long. As the fighter closed in, its engine's rising hum passed through the airframe like a warning. Brown's mind filled with fragmented thoughts, training manuals, survival protocols, the faces of his crew. None of them offered guidance for the moment he faced now. The logic was simple. A German fighter approaching an isolated bomber had only one purpose. Then the unexpected occurred. The Bf-109 did not fire. It drew nearer with controlled restraint, its guns angled but dormant, its movement deliberate rather than predatory. Instead of banking into an attack run, the fighter slid alongside the bomber, matching its faltering speed. The distance closed to a span so narrow Brown could make out the pilot's features: helmet, goggles, the intensity of concentration rather than hostility. The moment felt impossible. In all his training, in all his expectations, no scenario accounted for this. Word rippled through the bomber as crewmen forced themselves to lift their heads, each wanting confirmation of the impossible sight. One by one, they saw it. A German ace flying level with them, his aircraft steady, his guns silent. A waist gunner, barely conscious, stared through a hole torn in the fuselage in open disbelief. The flight engineer, gripping the overhead frame to steady himself, watched the Bf-109 hold formation as though escorting them rather than hunting them. Confusion replaced terror, but with it came a deeper unease, the uncertainty of motives they could not read. Brown sensed something in the fighter's posture, something he could not yet name. It wasn't hostility, and it wasn't exactly mercy. It was purpose, quiet, measured, and directed entirely at Ye Olde Pub. The German pilot studied the bomber as though weighing a decision only he understood. Brown felt the weight of that gaze across the cold air between them, and a question formed that had no answer. Why was the enemy choosing to spare them? A new kind of struggle took root in the American crew. It was no longer the battle against altitude or failing systems, nor the desperate fight to repel an attack. It was the disorienting challenge of facing the unknown, an uncertainty more unsettling than any enemy maneuver. The men had braced for destruction. Now they faced the frightening possibility of something far more complicated. The bomber drifted on, the fighter beside it like a shadow refusing to detach. And in that fragile pairing, the air around them shifted, preparing both crews for a decision that would redefine the encounter entirely. Stigler eased his fighter closer to the cockpit of the wounded B-17 until his presence could no longer be dismissed as chance. Then, with one gloved hand, he made a series of deliberate gestures, signals rarely used in the chaos of combat and almost never exchanged between enemies. He pointed first toward the ground, TH, and ahead, then sharply to the right. The motions were slow and defined, intended not to command but to warn. In an air war ruled by speed and lethality, this silent communication felt as fragile as glass suspended in winter air. From the cockpit of Ye Olde Pub, Charlie Brown struggled to interpret the shapes forming just beyond the fractured canopy. The cracks distorted perspective, and exhaustion blurred his focus, but the intention behind the gestures was unmistakable. Turn away from something ahead, something unseen. Brown blinked hard, steadying himself, trying to understand why a German ace would offer direction rather than destruction. There were no manuals for this moment, no protocol for an enemy extending guidance instead of gunfire. Below them stretched a landscape punctuated by airfields, rail yards, and anti-aircraft emplacements. Stigler knew their positions intimately. He had flown over them countless times on both ascent and return. He also knew that a lone bomber limping across German airspace would invite immediate attention from flak batteries eager to claim a victory. If they opened fire, they would not differentiate between friend and foe. A Bf-109 escorting an American bomber risked being targeted as readily as the bomber itself. Yet Stigler altered his position anyway, sliding beneath the B-17's right wing, placing himself where German gunners would hesitate to fire. For Brown, the gesture was nearly incomprehensible. The fighter was no longer a predator circling wounded prey. It had become a shield, interposing itself between the bomber and the threat below. Stigler's movements were precise, almost ceremonial, as though he were guiding a damaged comrade rather than an enemy. He nudged the formation just enough to steer Ye Olde Pub away from the densest flak zones, using the subtleties of formation flying to carve a safer path through hostile air. Every second of this improvised escort carried enormous risk. If German fighters rose from nearby airfields, they would see a Luftwaffe ace flying in formation with an American bomber, an image that invited immediate suspicion. Even worse were the consequences should his superiors learn of this act. Assisting the enemy, even indirectly, was a violation that could be interpreted as treason. Stigler understood these risks with perfect clarity. He accepted them anyway, holding his position with a steadiness that defied the brutal simplicity of wartime expectation. Inside the B-17, disbelief shifted into a tentative trust. Crewmen watched through shattered perspex as the German fighter matched their every movement, adjusting speed and angle with a sureness that kept the two aircraft locked in a fragile partnership. It was not an alliance, not in any formal sense. It was something more precarious, an improvised convoy created through mutual recognition of humanity's thin presence amid machinery built for destruction. Together, the aircraft moved through the sky like mismatched companions forced into synchronization. The B-17, wounded and heavy, drifted with uneven rhythm. The Bf-109, sleek and agile, compensated with minute adjustments that kept them aligned. Below them, German guns remained silent, confused by a formation that defied every pattern of the war. In that unlikely pairing, a new idea emerged, one shaped not by strategy but by restraint. Survival did not have to come through dominance or firepower. In this narrow corridor of air, survival came through coordinated mercy, enacted by two pilots who had every reason to kill and none to trust. And yet, as they approached the edge of German airspace, the fragile balance between them faced its greatest test. The coastline emerged slowly, a thin gray line separating winter sky from the darker expanse of the North Sea. Along that boundary waited some of the most disciplined air defenses in northern Germany, radar stations that swept the horizon in measured arcs, flak batteries arranged in calculating grids, and observation posts trained to identify every silhouette that dared approach. As Ye Olde Pub and the Bf-109 drifted toward this final threshold, the stillness of the air belied the tension gathering below. Screens flickered, headsets crackled, crews leaned over instruments as two aircraft, one enemy, one friendly, advanced in improbable formation. Stigler understood precisely what those radar operators would see. He knew the protocols that governed their reactions, the narrow windows in which decisions were made. A lone B-17, severely damaged, limping toward the sea, would normally trigger an immediate series of responses. Track, verify, engage. What the operators would not expect, what their equipment was not designed to interpret, was a German fighter flying tightly alongside the wounded bomber, its position obscuring key signatures. With practiced subtlety, Stigler shifted his Bf-109 until it partially masked the bomber's radar profile, presenting the illusion of a single German aircraft return. Ing from a sortie, it was a fragile deception, dependent on angles and timing, but for the moment it held. In the cockpit of the B-17, Charlie Brown felt the coastline's approach not as relief, but as a tightening awareness of what the German had been risking. The fighter's position was unmistakable now. Stigler was not simply accompanying them, he was shielding them. The realization came slowly, filtered through exhaustion and disbelief, and settled on Brown with a kind of quiet awe. He had prepared to die at the hands of this pilot. Instead, the man was offering protection at the very edge of his own country's defense network. Inside the fuselage, the crew sensed it as well. Though communication was limited to gestures and exhausted murmurs, a shared understanding passed through the bomber. The German fighter moved with deliberate purpose, easing ahead slightly, then dropping back, each adjustment calculated to draw attention away from ye olde pub. Crewmen peered through shattered perspex, watching flak towers slip beneath them, silent, motionless. No bursts of black smoke erupted around them. No tracer fire reached upward. The air, so often filled with the violence of coastal defenses, remained undisturbed. For the Americans, the silence was surreal. They had expected the coastline to be the most perilous stretch of their escape, a gauntlet of shells and explosions that could finish what the earlier attack had begun. Yet as the bomber crossed that invisible threshold, the danger did not materialize. Instead, the sea opened before them in a wide, muted expanse, the boundary between warfront and escape. And beside them, steady as a second wing, the German fighter held its course. Then Stigler made a final gesture. It was small, almost understated, one hand rising from the canopy, palm outward, a motion both farewell and warning. Ahead lay the open sea, the limit of his reach. Beyond this line, he could not follow without risking confrontation with Allied fighters or being misidentified by coastal observers on the opposite shore. This was the end of his escort, the edge of the space where his silence could shield them. Brown met the gesture with a weary nod, his face pale beneath the frost on the window. It was not the crisp acknowledgement of a military salute, but the slow, heavy movement of a man who understood the gravity of what had been given. Gratitude mixed with uncertainty, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that neither would fully be able to describe later. The crew watched as the Bf-109 drifted slightly left, then climbed with measured restraint, its engine rising in a controlled ascent rather than a sweeping turn. It was a respectful departure, one that maintained distance without breaking the fragile bond formed in the last, impossible stretch of their journey. For a moment, the two aircraft flew parallel, one rising, the other limping onward. It was a tableau suspended between war's brutality and its rare moments of grace. And as they parted over the edge of Germany's airspace, both pilots sensed that the encounter had become something far larger than a chance meeting in the winter sky, though neither yet knew where that meaning would lead. At the very edge of German airspace, where land dissolved into the muted haze above the North Sea, Stigler made his final decision. He eased the nose of the Bf-109 upward, climbing just enough to clear the B-17's path. Then, with a motion that was neither triumphant nor theatrical, he raised one hand in a small, unmistakable salute. It carried no flourish, only the quiet acknowledgement of a moment neither side had expected to survive. The gesture lingered for a heartbeat, suspended between two aircraft that should never have flown together. Brown watched it through frost-rimmed glass, his eyes slow to follow the fighter's ascent. The German's shape grew sharper for an instant, framed against the pale winter sky, then dissolved into a wall of cloud as though the air had swallowed him whole. There was no flash, no engine roar, no parting signal beyond the simple salute. One moment the Bf-109 was there, a constant presence against impossible odds. The next, the bomber was alone again. Silence reclaimed the interior of ye olde pub. Without the companion drifting beside them, the vastness of the sky seemed to widen. The crew felt the shift immediately. The brief sense of protection, fragile, improbable, evaporated, leaving them once more exposed to the cold arithmetic of altitude, fuel, and failing systems. Yet something else lingered as well. The knowledge that an enemy had held his fire, had risked everything to guide them through danger. It did not lessen their predicament, but it steadied them in a way they struggled to name. The coastline fell behind, replaced by an expanse of slate-gray water stretching toward the horizon. Brown glanced at the fuel gauges, watching the needles sink with unnerving steadiness. The calculations were merciless. The bomber's earlier damage had forced the engines to burn inefficiently, and the frigid air only deepened the strain. If the tanks ran dry too soon, the North Sea would become their only landing strip, a place where survival depended on luck more than skill. The crew understood the danger without needing to speak it. Those still capable tightened their belts and steadied loose equipment. The wounded were secured as best as the cramped fuselage allowed, their bandages stiff with cold. In their eyes, Brown saw a quiet acceptance that belied the chaos they had endured. Crash procedures rehearsed in training now appeared as vague, distant instructions, hard to recall in full, but sharp enough to guide their final moments if it came to that. For Brown, the cockpit became a narrow world of dials, trembling needles, and the low, uneven pulse of the remaining engines. His hands felt heavier with each passing mile, as though the cold had settled deeper into his bones. Every adjustment he made, trim, throttle, rudder, demanded focus he no longer possessed in full. Yet he persisted, forcing his attention outward, searching for anything that resembled a coastline friendly to the wounded aircraft he fought to keep airborne. The North Sea stretched on without promise. The horizon blurred into mist, the air thick with the faint moisture of distant storms. Brown scanned for a shape, a shadow, a fragment of land. The bomber descended gradually, losing altitude in slow, stubborn increments. Each drop reminded him how little time remained. The fuel gauges neared their limits, the engines sputtering with quiet warning. Then faintly a line of color appeared ahead, darker than sea, lighter than cloud. It might have been a trick of light. It might have been a hallucination born of exhaustion. But as the bomber edged closer, the line sharpened into the undeniable outline of a coastline. The shape of cliffs, fields, and uneven shoreline grew clearer, resolving into the geography of Allied territory. There was no cheer from the crew, no sudden release of tension. They were too weak, too drained, too aware that safety still rested on the narrowest margins. Yet relief settled over them in slow, measured breaths. Against expectation, against doctrine, against the long odds of winter skies, they were crossing back, just barely into friendly air. The engines coughed once more, their rhythm faltering as the last of the fuel thinned. And as Ye Olde Pub descended toward the coastline by the slimmest of margins, the crew carried with them the memory of a German pilot vanishing into cloud, leaving behind a moment of mercy that would outlive the war itself. Brown felt the engines falter again as the English coastline widened beneath them. The bomber had crossed into friendly territory, but safety remained distant. With their fuel nearly consumed and their altitude slipping away, he aimed for the first airfield capable of receiving an emergency landing. It was a makeshift strip, shorter than standard, bordered by winter-mudded fields, and not designed for aircraft carrying this level of damage. Still, it was a strip of earth, not water, and that alone made it the best chance they had left. Brown lowered the flaps with trembling hands, praying the battered hydraulics would respond. On the ground, controllers saw the incoming aircraft long before they understood its condition. Radio silence suggested a communications failure, and the bomber's erratic approach forced the tower to clear the landing zone immediately. Ground crews sprinted into position, fire trucks rumbling forward, medics bracing stretchers and equipment at the runway's edge. The bomber dipped low, its undercarriage groaning as it extended, one wheel locking unevenly. The men below could see daylight through holes in the fuselage. They could see the shredded tail. They could count the wounds inflicted from nose to rudder. The aircraft flew like a relic returned from a realm it was not meant to survive. Brown focused on the runway's pale outline through fogged, fractured glass. Every instinct urged him to pull up to correct the descent to readjust, but the bomber no longer had the strength for delicate control. Its left wing sagged, its flaps stuttered, and the remaining engines labored with a coarse, uneven rhythm. He guided the aircraft down not through finesse, but through sheer determination, holding the control column steady as the ground rushed toward them. The wheels struck with violent force, shuddering through the fuselage like a breaking wave. One tire hit a patch of uneven ground and nearly tore free, sending the bomber lurching sideways. Brown fought the skid, his muscles igniting in pain as he hauled the aircraft back towards centerline. Sparks trailed behind them, metal scraped across concrete. For a moment, the bomber seemed ready to fold under its own weight. Then, at last, its momentum broke, and the aircraft rolled to an unsteady halt near the far end of the runway. Before the engines had fully spun down, medics surged forward. They pried open the fuselage's warped panels, cutting through twisted metal to reach the wounded. The inside of the aircraft was colder than the air outside, carrying the sharp scent of hydraulic fluid and smoke. Crewmen were lifted gently onto stretchers, some conscious, some drifting in and out, all marked by the strain of the ordeal. The tail gunner was removed with particular care, his silence heavy but respected. The medics worked quickly, measuring pulses, stabilizing wounds, guiding the injured toward waiting ambulances. Behind them, a group of officers gathered. They stared at the bomber not as a machine, but as evidence of something remarkable and unsettling. Even in wartime, it was rare to witness an aircraft this damaged return intact. Holes riddled the fuselage in dense clusters, cables hung severed, turrets were cracked open. The tail section looked as though it had been clawed apart by the sky itself. To the officers, the survival of the crew felt less like probability and more like defiance. When Brown stepped onto the runway, supported by a medic, he was exhausted beyond expression. His face was pale, his uniform stiff with frost and soot. Yet when asked for his report, he straightened slightly, determined to relay the truth. He described the flak, the fighter attacks, the injuries. Then, with measured caution, he explained the appearance of a German Bf-109, a fighter that had closed in, studied them, and refused to fire. A fighter that had flown beside them, shielded them, and broken away only at the coastline. The officers listened, their expressions unreadable. It was not disbelief born of doubt in Brown's integrity. It was disbelief at the story itself, at the contradiction it presented. War rarely allowed for shades of mercy, and air combat least of all. The notion of a German ace shepherding a crippled bomber to safety seemed too improbable, too discordant with the realities they faced daily. Yet the bomber sat behind them, battered but whole. The crew lived, and somewhere above the winter clouds, the truth waited for a world not yet ready to accept it. Brown finished his report quietly, aware that the full weight of the encounter had yet to be understood. And as night began to settle over the airfield, another story, one still unfolding, prepared to emerge from the shadows of disbelief. In the hours that followed the landing, as the crew of Ye Olde Pub lay in hospital wards or sat bundled in blankets near pot-bellied stoves, Charlie Brown was summoned to provide a formal debriefing. He expected questions about altitude, formation integrity, flak concentrations. Instead, the officers focused intensely on a single detail: the presence of a German fighter flying in formation beside a crippled bomber. Brown gave his account carefully, describing what he had seen in clear, unsentimental terms. He spoke of the fighter's silence, its protective maneuvers, the unmistakable moment of escort at the coastline. When he finished, there was a pause and then an instruction delivered with measured authority. He was not to discuss the incident further. It was not a reprimand, it was a containment. Enemy mercy had no place in wartime narrative. The morale of crews depended on certainty that discipline could protect them, that formation could defend them, and that the enemy, relentless and calculating, would press every advantage. To admit that a German ace had guided an American bomber to safety risked introducing a crack into that certainty, a suggestion that the air war was not purely mechanical in its cruelty. Brown understood the reasoning even as it unsettled him. He nodded, affirmed the order, and said no more, but the silence pressed against him with unexpected weight. Across the continent, France Stigler filed no claim for a kill that day. There was nothing to report, nothing that conformed to the metrics by which victory was measured. His logbook for the mission remained sparse: altitude, fuel usage, weather conditions. No mention of a crippled bomber drifting over the North Sea. No reference to hand signals exchanged between enemies. No acknowledgement of the moment when doctrine yielded to conscience. In the bureaucratic structure of the Luftwaffe, omissions were safer than explanations, and he understood instinctively that this encounter was best left unrecorded. His squadron returned to the airfield without ceremony. Mechanics refueled the fighters. Officers reviewed standard reports. The rhythm of operational life resumed as though nothing unusual had transpired. But Stigler carried the weight of the morning within him, replaying the images with a clarity that refused to fade. The wounded crew, the inert guns, the pilot fighting exhaustion in the cockpit of a dying machine. There was no medal for restraint, no commendation for mercy. The sky recognized only victory or defeat, and he had chosen neither. Both men returned to their respective wars, separated by ideology, allegiance, and geography, yet bound quietly by the same memory. For Brown, the months that followed were marked by continued missions, long hours in the cockpit, and nights when the echo of cannon fire threaded through his sleep. He flew again because duty required it, but each mission carried the residue of that earlier encounter. The image of the German fighter beside him would surface in moments of turbulence or silence, uninvited but persistent. It was not comfort he drew from it, nor confusion, but a question without shape. Why had he been spared? What calculation, what instinct had stayed the enemy's hand? Stigler, too, continued flying. But Germany, by 1944, was collapsing beneath him. Factories burned, cities crumbled. The Luftwaffe's squadrons grew thin, their pilots younger, their missions increasingly desperate. He watched friends fail to return, watched replacements arrive with insufficient training, watched the arc of the war bend decisively toward defeat. Amid the noise and attrition, he carried a private uncertainty. Had his decision that winter morning been an act of courage or an act of futility? Compassion had been a quiet gesture, but in a war consuming everything around him, he sometimes wondered whether it carried a price he had yet to understand. For Brown, the war ended with his return home, alive but forever changed. The celebrations around him felt too bright, too loud, as though the world wished to erase the shadows of the conflict through sheer exuberance. Yet he carried the war in the tremors that lingered in his hands, in the fractured sleep that visited him each night, in the memories that surfaced without warning. His family welcomed him with relief, unaware of the weight he bore. He did not share the story of the German ace, not because he feared disbelief, but because the order given to him had taken root. Silence had become habit, and habit became barrier. Stigler survived the war as well, though his homeland was unrecognizable when the fighting finally ceased. He stepped through ruins that had once been familiar streets, past buildings with their interiors exposed like open wounds, and saw the cost of a war he had fought with unwavering discipline. He wondered about the bomber he had spared, about whether it had made the crossing, whether the crew had lived. But in the years that followed, life demanded new focus, work, stability, the long process of rebuilding. The war receded into memory, though certain moments remained fixed, bright as flares in the dark. Both nations moved forward with differing narratives of victory and loss. The air forces that had clashed in the skies now curated their histories, selecting stories that reinforced national identity. In such narratives, mercy between enemies held little place. The accounts that survived were those of triumph, sacrifice, and tragedy, the clean, structured lines of stories that supported collective understanding. The encounter between Ye Olde Pub and a single German fighter was not among them. It was too ambiguous, too quiet, too resistant to categorization. For decades, the event existed only in the minds of two men who had never met beyond that brief winter sky. They carried it like a sealed envelope, unopened by those around them. Each wondered in distant moments about the other. Each questioned whether the memory had been interpreted correctly, or whether time had softened the corners into something gentler than truth. But neither knew where to seek the answers, or whether they would be welcomed if found. Time does not erase silence, it deepens it. The war ended with cities liberated, treaties signed, armies disbanded. But the sky over the North Sea, where a German pilot had chosen mercy and an American pilot had accepted it without understanding, remained suspended in a kind of stillness. The encounter, set against the vast machinery of global conflict, lingered only as a private recollection. Yet memories, especially those born of war, rarely remain dormant forever. And as the years continued on, a question older than the conflict itself waited patiently for the moment when silence would finally break. Nearly 40 years after the cold morning above the North Sea, Charlie Brown found himself staring at a thin folder on his desk, its edges worn soft by time, its contents incomplete, its questions unresolved. He had lived a full life since the war, a career, a family, a quiet retirement. Yet the memory of that German fighter had never left him. It visited him in unexpected moments, in the hum of a passing aircraft, in the silence before sleep, in the unasked questions that seemed to grow heavier with age. Now, with the war receding into history rather than memory, he felt compelled to seek what had long been denied him, an answer. His search began in military archives, in records yellowed by decades and often incomplete. He pored over mission logs, Luftwaffe rosters, and accounts from both sides of the conflict, narrowing his focus to the region and date of his encounter. But official documentation offered little help. Battles were recorded, anomalies were not. The moment that had defined his survival had been ignored by the machinery of war, lost in a system that acknowledged only kills, losses, or victories. Brown persisted nonetheless. He wrote letters to historical societies, filed requests with veteran organizations, and contacted former airmen whose memories might have intersected with the path of that solitary Bf-109. Across the Atlantic, Franz Stigler lived quietly in Canada, having left the broken remnants of post-war Germany behind him. He rarely spoke of his time as a fighter pilot. The war had taken too much, left too many absences, and offered too few certainties. In the modest calm of civilian life, he found no reason to revisit the decisions etched into his memory with equal parts pride and doubt. Of the bomber he had spared, he assumed only one outcome. Given the extent of its damage, he believed it had not survived the attempt to cross the North Sea. He imagined it had slipped beneath the waves in silence, taking with it the men he had chosen not to kill. Stigler carried that assumption quietly for decades. It was not grief, exactly, more the lingering ache of an unanswered question. He had chosen mercy, and mercy often came with uncertainty, but he never sought confirmation. Life had moved forward, and he moved with it, leaving the past folded away like a letter never sent. Then one winter afternoon, a veteran's publication arrived in his mailbox. It was a modest magazine filled with stories of wartime service, personal recollections, and accounts of missions long forgotten. Stigler skimmed through it without expectation, until one headline caught his eye, a story written by a former American bomber pilot describing an encounter with a German fighter over Germany in 1943. The words were spare, factual, restrained. They spoke of a crippled B-17, a silent BF-109, and a moment of mercy that defied the logic of air war. Stigler read the passage once, then again, slower this time. The details aligned with his memory precisely, the damage to the bomber, the hand gestures, the escort to the coastline. There was no question, he whispered to himself, it was them, they lived. The realization struck with unexpected force. The decision he had made in the brief space of minutes, made with uncertainty, made with compassion, had not ended in tragedy after all. The men he had spared had survived. After decades of silence, the truth reached him at last. Moved by a mixture of relief and disbelief, Stigler found the courage to reach out. He wrote a letter to the publication, identifying himself as the pilot in Brown's account. The editors forwarded it to Brown, who received the envelope with trembling hands. It had been nearly half a century since their encounter in the winter sky. Brown unfolded the letter slowly, reading the German's words with a sense of unreality. Stigler was alive, he remembered. And he was reaching across time to answer a question Brown had carried for most of his life. Their first phone call came soon after. When the line connected, neither man spoke immediately. The silence was not awkward. It was dense with years of uncertainty, years of private memory, years of assuming the other had vanished into the war's long shadow. Brown finally spoke Stigler's name. The German inhaled sharply, recognizing the voice of a man he had seen briefly through shattered perspex. The conversation began haltingly, as though neither wanted to disturb the fragile reality of the moment. But then the words came, slow at first, then steady, unfolding the two halves of a single event. Brown described the bomber's state, the fear of those final minutes, the disbelief as the fighter refused to fire. Stigler explained his hesitation, his instructor's warning, the sight of wounded men who no longer possessed the strength to defend themselves. They spoke of responsibility, of conscience, of survival. And as each man realized the depth of the other's experience, the emotional restraint each had carried through decades began to crack. Both men cried, not with the abandon of youth, but with the quiet release of survivors who finally understood the full meaning of what had passed between them. Their tears were not for the violence they had endured, but for the mercy that had outlasted it. In that moment, the war felt distant, yet its imprint remained in every word they shared. The conversation stretched long into the evening, redefining an event that had lived for decades as a private mystery. What had once been a wartime anomaly, a break in the pattern of destruction, became, at last, a human connection restored. The silence that had shaped the encounter for nearly half a century dissolved, replaced by understanding, gratitude, and a bond that belonged neither to victory nor defeat. And as they prepared to meet in person for the first time since the winter sky over Germany, the past shifted once more, moving from memory into recognition, from silence into story, from anomaly into reunion. Their meeting took place in a modest room in Seattle, far from the airfields, command posts, and frozen altitudes that had defined their first encounter. Charlie Brown entered slowly, leaning on a cane, age having finally claimed what wartime never had. Across the room, Franz Stigler rose to greet him. The years had thinned his frame and silvered his hair, yet the posture, the quiet steadiness of a fighter pilot, remained unmistakable. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They simply looked at one another, two aging figures connected by a memory neither had fully understood until now. Then, almost simultaneously, they stepped forward and embraced. It was the greeting of men long separated, not enemies meeting for the first time. The conversation flowed with unusual ease. They spoke of their families, their careers, their decades apart. Brown described the cold terror of that winter morning, the struggle to keep the bomber level, the disbelief as the German fighter appeared beside him. Stigler recounted the hesitation, the voices of training and conscience competing in the span of seconds, and the moment he realized he could not fire. With each detail exchanged, the gap between them narrowed. They were no longer pilot and pursuer, no longer American and German. They were simply two survivors who had carried the weight of a single choice across nearly half a century. Their friendship deepened in the years that followed. They visited one another's homes, met one another's families, and shared stories that had remained unspoken for decades. It was an unlikely bond, one born from restraint in a place where restraint had no precedent. Their wives watched the friendship grow with a mix of admiration and quiet awe. Their children and grandchildren witnessed something rarer still, the collapse of wartime logic in the presence of genuine understanding. The men who should have destroyed one another now spoke, with a warmth that defied the boundaries of nationality and history. As their story began to surface among veterans, groups, and historians, the reaction shifted from skepticism to astonishment. Accounts from both sides corroborated the encounter. Surviving crew members of Ye Olde Pub shared their memories, recalling the shock of seeing the German pilot refuse to fire. German records revealed the unclaimed mission. Gradually, what had once seemed improbable acquired the structure of historical fact. Scholars came to regard the incident as an anomaly of the air war, an act of compassion where only calculation was expected. Yet the meaning reached beyond history. Military analysts noted the significance of restraint in the midst of overwhelming violence. Psychologists examined the moral courage required to break from doctrine in a rigid hierarchy. Veterans recognized the moment as something profoundly human, a reminder that war's machinery could not fully extinguish individual conscience. The incident was studied not for its strategic value, but for its humanity. It offered a rare example of courage defined not by daring or firepower, but by the refusal to act in a way that violated one's own sense of honor. Brown and Stigler, however, rarely described their story in such grand terms. For them, the significance was personal. They had lived long enough to understand what survival cost and what mercy could restore. Their friendship became a quiet testament to the idea that wartime enemies could, with time and reflection, become something closer to brothers. They wrote letters, shared photographs, and attended gatherings together. At each event, they were asked to recount the story that linked them. They did so calmly, without embellishment, and with the same steady tone that had defined their lives as pilots. As the decades advanced, the effects of age slowed them both. Yet they continued to speak regularly, each recognizing in the other a companion shaped by the same sky. They had lived through an era that demanded extremes, and they had survived by choices that diverged from those extremes. In their final years, the past no longer carried the sharpness of trauma. It had softened into understanding, an understanding made possible only because both men had endured long enough to share it. Brown passed away first, surrounded by family, his final years marked by gratitude rather than confusion. Stigler followed only months later, his absence mirroring his friend's, as if maintaining formation one final time. Their deaths closed a narrative that had stretched across continents, decades, and the shifting landscapes of memory, yet their story did not end with them. It lived on in the accounts they left behind, in the scholars who continued to study the encounter, and in the families who preserved the legacy of two men. Ho chose humanity amid the machinery of war. In museums and books, their names began appearing side by side. An American pilot and a German ace presented not as adversaries, but as two halves of a single story. Their encounter became a point of reflection in discussions about the nature of conflict, reminding listeners that even in the most destructive environments, individual choices could shape outcomes far beyond the moment in which they were made. The narrative challenged assumptions about courage, reframing it as something deeper than aggression or victory. It suggested that the highest form of bravery might be found not in the willingness to kill, but in the strength required to hold one's fire. And as historians revisited the air war over Europe, they often paused at the image of a wounded bomber drifting beside a silent fighter, a tableau suspended in the cold winter air, impossible yet undeniably real. It was a moment that refused to conform to the harsh geometry of the conflict, and for that reason it endured. In the end, their story offered a quiet reminder that the sky, vast and indifferent, sometimes carried acts of grace alongside acts of destruction. It remembered the day when a killer's trigger remained untouched, because a German ace faced a helpless bomber and chose the unthinkable.